It is the year 1346, and the world is alive. You are standing in a market square in Genoa, one of the wealthiest trading cities in the known world. Around you, merchants argue in 4 languages at once. Bolts of Chinese silk are unwrapped on wooden tables. Crates of spices from India sit stacked against stone walls. A money changer counts coins from Persia. A scribe copies a contract for a ship that will leave for Constantinople by morning. Everything is moving. Everything is connected. The Silk Road, the greatest trading network the medieval world ever built, runs all the way from the coast of China to this square, and its traffic has never been heavier. This is a Europe at the peak of its medieval confidence. The great cathedrals of France and England have been rising for 2 centuries. Universities in Bologna and Paris are producing lawyers, theologians, philosophers. The population of Europe has doubled in 300 years. Cities that were villages in the year 1000 are now places of genuine power, genuine culture, genuine ambition. The medieval world looks at itself and sees a civilization that is expanding, that has always expanded, that will keep expanding. Now look east, past Constantinople, past the Black Sea, out onto the vast flat silence of the Central Asian steppe. Something is moving there. Something that has no army, no flag, no name that anyone in this market square has ever heard. It does not need any of those things. It has been moving for years. It moves along the same roads that brought the silk and the spices. It is coming west at the pace of a trading caravan, and it is already closer than anyone in this square understands. The world you are standing in right now, this loud, alive, expanding world, has perhaps 1 year left. Before it ever touched a single European body, the plague had already been killing for years. Historians now believe it originated somewhere on the Central Asian steppe, possibly in the region of modern Kyrgyzstan, in the 1330s. The evidence sits in graveyards. Archaeologists working in the 19th century found burial sites near Lake Issyk-Kul, dating to 1338 and 1339, with inscriptions that identify the cause of death simply as pestilence. The numbers buried in those sites spike dramatically above normal mortality. Something killed a large number of people in that place at that time. Then it began to move. It moved the way everything moved in the medieval world, along the trade routes. The Silk Road was not one road. It was a web of interconnected paths, rivers, and sea lanes, stretching across the entire breadth of the known world, from the Pacific coast of China to the Atlantic coast of Europe. For centuries, it had been the circulatory system of global commerce. Now it became something else. Now it was a highway. The plague moved through Central Asia. It crossed into Persia. It reached the Crimea by 1346. At a Genoese trading post called Kaffa on the northern coast of the Black Sea, it was already killing when a Mongol army laid siege to the city walls. Medieval chroniclers record something almost too strange to believe, that the Mongol forces, dying in extraordinary numbers outside the walls, began catapulting their own dead over the fortifications into the city below. Whether or not that account is precisely accurate, the plague got inside the walls of Kaffa, and then the Genoese merchants who survived loaded their ships and sailed for home. They brought everything with them, including what they could not see. October 1347, the port of Messina on the northeastern tip of Sicily. 12 Genoese trading ships have arrived from the Black Sea. The harbor workers who come to meet them find something they cannot immediately process. Most of the sailors are dead. They are still at their posts, slumped at oars, collapsed on deck, as if the ships sailed themselves the final miles into harbor. Those still alive are barely alive. They are covered in swellings the size of eggs, growing in the armpits, the groin, the neck. The swellings are black at the center, weeping blood and pus. The sailors who can still speak are burning with fever. Their breath smells of something that the harbor workers have no word for. Their skin, in places, has darkened to the color of a bruise that covers the whole body. The port authorities of Messina make a decision. They order the ships out of the harbor immediately. Every ship, every sailor, back to sea. No unloading, no contact. Get them away from this city. The order is fast. It is decisive. It is the right call. It is already too late. In the hours and days before anyone knew to give that order, the ships had been at anchor. Rats had come and gone along the mooring ropes, the way rats always do in every port in the world. Fleas had moved between rats and sailors and dock workers without anyone noticing, because fleas always move that way. The thing the harbor master was trying to keep outside the walls was already inside them, already in the streets, already in the homes of the families of the men who came to look at those ships. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and Europe had no idea what it was. Stop here. Before this story moves any further, you need to understand what the plague actually was. Not the numbers, not the politics, what it did to a person. Because without that, everything that follows is just history at a distance. And this was never a story at a distance. The bacterium responsible is called Yersinia pestis. It lived primarily in the bloodstream of rats, carried from rat to rat, and from rat to human, by fleas. When an infected flea bit a person, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and moved immediately to the lymph nodes, the small glands distributed through the body that are part of the immune system. The lymph nodes responded to the invasion the way they always respond to infection. They swelled. But Yersinia pestis overwhelmed that response so completely that the swelling did not stop. The lymph nodes in the armpit, the groin, the neck grew to the size of an egg, then an orange. They turned black. They became agonizing to touch. They filled with blood and pus and fluid. Medieval physicians called these swellings buboes, which is where the name bubonic plague comes from. Then came the fever, not a mild fever. A fever that arrived like a wall, sudden, total, disorienting. The skin became sensitive to any touch. The mind began to drift. Some patients vomited blood. In cases where the bacteria reached the lungs, pneumonic plague, the coughing began, and it produced a fine bloody mist that carried the disease directly through the air from one person to the next. In cases where it entered the bloodstream directly, septicemic plague. The skin darkened across the whole body as hemorrhages spread beneath the surface. The dying turned black. That is where the name came from. From first symptoms to death, sometimes 5 days, sometimes 2, sometimes less. A man who felt perfectly well on Monday morning could be dead by Wednesday night, and the people who nursed him, who held him, who breathed the same air in a room with no ventilation, they were already infected before he died. Venice watched the plague coming and did something no city in Europe had done before. It tried to think. By early 1348, the reports from Sicily, from Genoa, from Marseille were impossible to ignore. The plague was real. It was moving fast. It was killing everyone it touched. And Venice, the most internationally connected trading city in the world, with ships arriving daily from every infected port in the Mediterranean, was more exposed than almost any city on earth. The city's leaders understood this. They sat down and asked a question that almost nobody else in Europe was asking in the winter of 1348. Not why is God punishing us, and not what does this mean for our sins. They asked something more practical, more cold-eyed, more modern. They asked, how do we stop it getting in? Their answer was quarantine. Ships arriving from infected ports would be required to anchor in the harbor for a period of time before anyone on board was permitted to come ashore. If after that period the crew was still alive and showed no signs of disease, they could land. If not, the ship stayed at anchor until they did, or until they died. The original period was 30 days, Trentino in Italian. It was later extended to 40, 40 giorni. The word quarantine comes directly from those 40 days, from this city, from this crisis, from these men sitting around a table in 1348, trying to hold a line against something they did not fully understand. It slowed things down. It was not enough. The plague got in anyway, through gaps in enforcement, through ships that arrived before the order was fully in place, through the sheer impossibility of sealing a city whose entire economy ran on open water. Venice lost between a third and a half of its population. But the idea it invented, the systematic isolation of the potentially infected, would echo forward 6 centuries to every pandemic that followed, including the ones in living memory. Of all the cities the Black Death destroyed, Florence left the most detailed record of its own destruction, because Florence, in 1348, happened to contain one of the greatest writers of the medieval world. Giovanni Boccaccio was 35 years old when the plague reached his city. He did not flee. He stayed, and he watched, and he wrote everything down. The introduction to his collection of stories called the Decameron is not fiction. It is eyewitness testimony. It is one of the most shattering documents in all of European literature. And it describes what happened to a city of 100,000 people with a clarity and a steadiness of nerve that is almost unbearable to read. He describes neighbors refusing to help neighbors, not out of cruelty, out of terror. He describes fathers who would not enter the rooms of their own dying children, mothers who would not hold their own sick infants. He describes bodies piling in the streets outside the doors of houses because the families inside could not bring themselves to carry them further, and the city had run out of people to do the carrying. Gravediggers demanded extraordinary sums of money to touch the dead, and still there were not enough of them. Bodies were loaded onto carts. He uses the word stacked, and taken to mass graves on the edges of the city, layered in like cargo. Florence lost between 45 and 60% of its population in less than 5 months, not over years, months. The banking families whose names still mark the streets of modern Florence, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, lost so many heirs and partners and debtors to the plague that their institutions collapsed entirely. The city that was building the Renaissance lost, for a generation, the people who would have built it faster. Boccaccio kept writing. He finished the Decameron. Perhaps that was the only answer he had left. You need to understand something before this story goes any further. The people who tried to stop the Black Death were not stupid. They were not negligent. They were not primitive. They were the most educated, most respected, most professionally qualified minds in the medieval world. And they had an answer, a complete, coherent, institutionally endorsed answer. It was called miasma. It was completely wrong, and their certainty that they were right made everything worse. Miasma theory held that disease rose from rotting organic matter as an invisible poisonous vapor, drifted through the air at ground level, and entered the body through the lungs. It had deep roots in ancient Greek medicine. Hippocrates himself had outlined a version of it. By 1348, it had been the dominant framework of European medicine for over 1,000 years. Every major medical faculty in Europe taught it. Every licensed physician believed it. And here is the thing about miasma theory that makes it so devastating to understand. It made sense. The poorest neighborhoods, where waste was most concentrated and the smell was worst, did have the highest death rates. The correlation was real. The conclusion was wrong. Because the real killer was not the smell. The real killer was the rats and the fleas that thrived in the same conditions that produced the smell. Bad air didn't spread the plague. Bad sanitation created the conditions for the actual mechanism. But miasma theory couldn't see the difference, so physicians prescribed burning aromatic herbs. They recommended avoiding the cold night air. They suggested bloodletting to rebalance the humors. They advised patients to move away from low-lying ground. Every intervention was logical within the framework. Every intervention was useless. Some were actively harmful. And the confidence with which they were prescribed, the absolute institutional certainty, meant that nobody in authority was looking in the right direction. The people trying to save everyone were pointing everyone the wrong way. When fear reaches a certain temperature, it needs somewhere to land. By 1348, the Black Death had killed so many people so fast that the medieval mind, already under unbearable strain, began searching for an explanation that fit its existing understanding of how the world worked. God sent punishment for sin. Sin required a sinner. The sinner had to be identifiable. And across Germany, France, Switzerland, and the Rhineland, an answer began to circulate through frightened communities with the speed and the logic of a rumor that people desperately wanted to believe. Jewish communities, the story went, had poisoned the wells. They had introduced the plague deliberately into Christian water supplies as an act of deliberate destruction. The accusation had no basis in reality. Jewish communities were dying from the plague at the same rates as everyone else. In some places faster, because the close-knit communal life that was a source of cultural strength also made disease transmission more efficient. But fear does not require evidence, it requires a target. What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns of mass murder in medieval European history. In Strasbourg in February 1349, approximately 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive in the Jewish cemetery before the plague had even reached the city. In Mainz, in Frankfurt, in Basel, entire communities killed, their property seized, their existence erased from towns that had contained Jewish populations for generations. Pope Clement VI issued 2 separate papal declarations stating explicitly that the accusations were false, that Jewish people were dying from the plague just like everyone else, and that the killings must stop. The killings continued. The plague was invisible, the fear was not, and the fear needed a face. There was another response, stranger in its way, and in its own fashion just as desperate. Beginning in Hungary in 1349 and spreading rapidly west across Germany, the Low Countries, and into France, groups of men began moving from town to town in organized processions, publicly beating themselves. Not privately in the quiet of a monastery cell, publicly in the town square before crowds of hundreds and sometimes thousands of witnesses. They walked in columns of 50 or 100 or 200, wearing robes marked with red crosses, carrying heavy leather straps embedded with iron spikes, and at intervals during their march they would stop, stripped to the waist, and whip themselves bloody in elaborate, choreographed rituals, singing hymns while they did it. They were called flagellants, from the Latin word for whip. They believed, with complete sincerity and absolute conviction, that the plague was divine punishment for human sin, and that extreme physical suffering, suffered voluntarily and publicly, could satisfy the anger of God and purchase protection for the communities they passed through. People lined the streets to watch them, many wept. Some joined on the spot. The Church's relationship with the flagellant movement was complicated. Initially, some local clergy tolerated or even encouraged it. By October 1349, Pope Clement VI had seen enough. He issued a bull condemning the flagellants, ordering their suppression, declaring their theology heretical. the movement declined, but slowly and not everywhere. In some regions it persisted for years. It achieved nothing. The plague did not spare the towns the flagellants passed through. It did not spare the flagellants themselves. The processions may in fact have spread it faster, moving infected people from community to community across hundreds of miles. But the need that produced the flagellants, the desperate human need to do something, anything, in the face of something uncontrollable, that need was completely real. It always is. Walk away from the cities for a moment. This story is not only about Florence and Venice and the great ports. It is also about what happened when the plague reached the places where most people actually lived. In 1348, the overwhelming majority of Europeans were not city dwellers. They were peasants. They worked the land in small villages scattered across France, England, Germany, Spain, and Italy. Communities of 200 or 300 people clustered around a church and a lord's estate, connected to the wider world mainly through the parish priest and the seasonal markets. These people had fewer connections to the trade routes that had brought the plague west. That gave them perhaps a few extra months. It did not save them. Walk into a village in rural England in the summer of 1349, the year the plague crossed the Channel, and you may find something more disturbing than a city in panic. You may find silence, a village with its doors open and no one inside, crops standing unharvested in the fields because there is no one left to bring them in, livestock wandering without owners, eating what they can find, dying eventually of neglect, a church with a fresh mound of earth in the yard that is too large to be a single grave. The chronicler Henry Knighton, writing in England, describes village after village in Leicestershire lying empty, their population so reduced that the remaining survivors could not maintain the farms. He writes of fields returning to wilderness within a single season, of the lords of estates who survived finding that they had land and no one to work it, of the fundamental economic bargain of medieval feudalism, labor in exchange for protection, beginning to dissolve simply because one side of the bargain had run out of people. The silence of those empty villages would echo for generations. The institution that medieval Europeans turned to in every crisis, in famine, in war, in grief, in confusion, was the Catholic Church. It was not simply a religious organization. It was the framework of meaning through which medieval people understood everything that happened to them. If a child died, the Church explained why. If a war came, the Church gave it context. If you sinned, the Church provided a path back to God. For 1,000 years it had been the load-bearing wall of European civilization. The Black Death attacked that wall directly. Priests administered last rites to the dying. That was not optional. It was a sacred obligation, and the men who held that obligation took it seriously. They entered the sick rooms. They touched the dying. They breathed the same air. They died at extraordinary rates, in some regions faster than any other identifiable group, because their role brought them into constant close contact with the infected. Entire parishes were left without clergy. Bishops scrambled to ordain replacements, cutting training requirements that had existed for generations, filling pulpits with men who barely knew the liturgy. And then came the question that no bishop, no cardinal, no pope had an answer for. If the Church stood in direct relationship with God, and if the plague was God's punishment, why were the priests dying? Why were the monks in their monasteries dying? Why were the cardinals dying? Why, in 1348, did Pope Clement VI have to flee Avignon and sit between two large fires to keep the disease away, a recommendation of his personal physician that actually worked, because the heat killed the fleas? While the city outside his palace lost half its people, the faith of millions did not collapse, but it cracked, quietly, in ways that would not fully manifest for a century and a half. The Black Death had begun to separate the Church from the absolute, unquestioning authority it had held for 500 years. The Reformation was not born in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his theses to a door in Wittenberg. It was born here, in the silence of parishes with no priests and graves with no last rites and prayers that were offered with complete sincerity and answered with nothing. By 1351, the first great wave is over. Stand in what remains of Europe and try to count. This is the hardest chapter to write, because the numbers are almost too large for the human mind to process as human, not as statistics, not as data points, as people, as individual people who had names and families, and harvests to bring in, and debts to settle they had held in their arms. Across Eurasia as a whole, historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died in the Black Death pandemic. The range is wide because medieval record-keeping was inconsistent, and because the plague struck some regions far harder than others. In Europe specifically, the most careful modern estimates suggest that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population died in the years between 1347 and 1351. In some regions, parts of Italy, southern France, the eastern Mediterranean, the mortality rate exceeded 60%. More than half of every person alive in those places, gone in 4 years. There is no historical analogy for this. Not the First World War, not the Second, not the Great Famines. No single event in recorded human history removed this proportion of a continent's population this quickly. The closest comparison that historians reach for is not another epidemic or another war. It is a meteor strike, something that arrives from outside the normal range of human experience and simply ends the world as it was. And here is the detail that makes the scale real in a way the numbers cannot. In village after village, town after town, city after city across Europe, there were not enough survivors to bury the dead. The Church's rituals required individual graves, individual prayers, individual acknowledgement of each departing soul. The Black Death made that impossible. Mass graves became not the exception but the standard. Entire generations were put in the ground, without ceremony, without record, without the dignity that the medieval world considered the minimum owed to any human being. The world that existed in 1346 was gone. What would grow in its place was not yet visible. Here is the cruelest detail in the entire story. It came back. The survivors of the first wave, the people who had lost half their families, rebuilt their lives from rubble, repaired their farms, reopened their shops, had children to fill the empty houses. Those people had perhaps a decade of uncertain peace before the plague returned. 1361, another outbreak. Not as catastrophic as the first, but killing tens of millions more. Then 1369, then 1374, then 1383. Wave after wave, arriving at intervals of roughly a decade across the next 3 centuries, each one smaller than the first, but each one landing on a population that had never fully recovered from the last. This is what the history books do not adequately convey. The Black Death was not an event. It was a condition. From 1347 until the last major European outbreak in 1722, nearly 400 years, the plague was a permanent feature of European life, not always killing in the numbers of that first terrible wave, but always possible, always returning, always capable of suddenly emptying a street or a village or a city in ways that no one could predict or prevent. Think about what that does to a culture over generations. Every person alive in Europe from the mid-14th century to the early 18th century grew up knowing that the plague could come back, that the world could change overnight. that the neighbor who was alive this morning might be dead by Friday, and their house standing empty by Sunday. That all of it, the farm, the business, the marriage, the children, could be taken at any moment without warning and without reason. That knowledge shaped European art, European religion, European philosophy, European attitudes toward time and money and love in ways that scholars are still trying to fully map. The obsession with death that marks so much medieval and Renaissance art, the danse macabre, the skulls in the paintings, the memento mori, does not come from a morbid imagination. It comes from lived experience, from a culture that had learned to look death directly in the face because it had no choice. Here is the chapter that surprises people. The Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe, and in doing so, it accidentally dismantled the system that had kept the surviving 2/3 in servitude for 500 years. Medieval feudalism ran on a simple and brutal logic. Land was controlled by lords and kings. The peasants who worked that land had almost no leverage. There were always more of them than there was land. They could be replaced. They had no bargaining power because they had no scarcity. When the Black Death was finished, that calculation had completely reversed. Labor was scarce. Land was abundant. Lords who had 20 peasants before the plague might have 5 or 6 after it, trying to maintain the same acreage. And those 5 or 6 knew, perhaps for the first time in the history of their families, that they were needed, that the Lord needed them more than they needed any particular lord. Wages rose across Europe for the first time in centuries. Serfs began to negotiate. Some walked away from the estates they had been legally bound to and found work elsewhere for better terms. The English Statute of Labourers of 1351, passed in a panic by a parliament of landlords trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, is itself evidence of how dramatically the power balance had shifted. You do not pass emergency legislation to suppress something that is not actually happening. The social rigidity of the medieval order, the idea that the place you were born into was the place you would die in, that your children would occupy the same rung of the hierarchy as your grandparents, began to loosen. A middle class began to grow in the space that the plague had cleared. Merchants and skilled craftsmen found that their services commanded new prices. The concentration of inherited wealth that had defined European society for centuries was disrupted by the simple fact that so many heirs had died. The Renaissance, the rise of humanism, the beginnings of the idea that an individual human life had inherent value and dignity independent of their social rank. All of it has a root, partial, complicated, contested by historians in the catastrophe of 1347. The plague that killed half of Europe created, in the wreckage, the conditions for a world that cared more about the half that survived. You take a pill, you expect it to work. You walk into a hospital and assume that the people inside know what is killing you and have a way to stop it. You trust, without thinking about it, that the water coming out of your tap will not kill your children. None of that is accidental. None of it arrived without cost. The Black Death forced the Western world to confront, at the most fundamental level, its complete helplessness before invisible death. The prayers did not work. The herbs did not work. The bloodletting did not work. The flagellants did not work. The scapegoating did not work. Nothing in the medieval toolkit worked, and out of that confrontation, slowly, across centuries, through the work of people whose names most of us never learned in school, came a different idea. The idea that disease was not divine punishment, that it was not caused by bad air or planetary alignments or the malice of outsiders, that it was a problem with a mechanism, and that if you could find the mechanism, you could find the answer. That idea took a long time to become germ theory. It took Pasteur and Koch and Lister and 100 other scientists working across the 18th and 19th centuries. It took John Snow removing a pump handle on a London street in 1854 and proving that water, not air, carried cholera. It took the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, which, it is worth noting, would have ended the Black Death almost completely within days if they had existed in 1347. Yersinia pestis is still alive. It exists in rodent populations in parts of Asia, Africa, and the American West. There are a handful of human cases every year. It is now treatable with common antibiotics. The bacterium that ended the medieval world and killed 100 million people is today, in most cases, a course of doxycycline. The distance between those two facts, between the mass graves of 1349 and the prescription that cures it today, is not just scientific progress. It is the accumulated cost of every person who died without understanding why, and every mind that refused to stop asking the question even when every existing answer was wrong. The 75 million dead of the 14th century did not die for nothing. They died into a world that was not yet ready to save them, and the world that grew from their absence, the world of public health and germ theory, and modern medicine, and the basic expectation that disease can be understood and defeated. That world is the one you are living in right now. I will leave you with the question that historians have argued about for decades. The Black Death did not just kill people, it broke systems. It broke the feudal order, the church's authority, the medical establishment's certainty, the social immobility that had defined European life for 5 centuries, and it replaced all of it with something more flexible, more questioning, more willing to ask whether the old answers were actually right. So here is the question. If the Black Death had never happened, if Europe had continued on its medieval trajectory, undisrupted, would the modern world exist at all? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this gave you something, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. There are stories on this channel that history books barely mention. We are just getting started.